This morning, Canadians from coast to coast to coast will gather at cenotaphs and memorials in communities throughout Canada to pay their respects to the 117,000 brave men and women who laid down their lives for us in war and in military operations both at home and overseas. From the early days of our history to the service of our troops today and in other corners of the world, we stand here today to honor, thank, and remember all those who have made the supreme sacrifice for our country, for our freedoms, and to renew our pledge to them to never forget.
Indeed, never forget, but we will. It's important to remember in book form, within the memory. And speaking of books, every year or so I publish a book, about 80,000 words maybe. That's a chapter or two, maybe, of one of the major works by Conrad Black, Baron Black of Crossharbour. And his latest one, Rise to Greatness, The History of Canada from the Vikings to the Present, is no exception. It's an extraordinary work, and it's a pleasure to welcome a wonderful writer and a good friend back to the show. How long did it take you?
Thank you so much, Michael. The research took a long time. As you know, as an author, it takes more time organizing the material and editing than actually writing it. If you're a nonfiction writer, as we are, if you can just put it out in approximately the right order, you've got a draft to work from. But I can roll the prose out fairly fast. But 400 years of Canadian history is a lot of research, and then the editing job is very careful.
It's extraordinary, and I mentioned to you before, Paul Johnson, who writes the preface or introduction, we admire him mutually. I was reminded of him. I mean, it's a challenging book. This is not dull history. It's really compelling, because a lot of people would say, Canadian history, a book of this size on Canadian history, oh please. But,
yeah, exactly, a snoozer, a surefire cure to insomnia. Well, unfortunately, I mean, I hate to say this, but previous histories of Canada, some of them, are just that.
Yes, they are.
They're most of them scholastically rigorous. You can't fault them on their accuracy, but they're inaccessible other than to a real specialist. They don't make the subject interesting. And if you just think about it for a second, there were only a handful of Europeans here with Champlain 400 years ago, and this is today a G7 country in a world of nearly 200 countries. It's a very clear, very consistent, steady success story. It's an interesting, successful story. Why hasn't it been presented interestingly?
Exactly. Because of the day, and we're going to have you on the show tomorrow as well for a more general view of the book. In terms of Canada's military, our contribution, there's been a lot of tampering with history and Trudeau and even Conservative governments. But as a military power, now let me rephrase it, as a military people, we have achieved a great deal for a very long time.
In a number of areas. The record of the so-called dominions in the world wars, but Canada, first of all, as Mr. Churchill kept reminding us, the premier dominion, of sending volunteers in such numbers that if we'd had conscription, the forces wouldn't have been any larger, not significantly so, overseas, when our countries, specifically this one, were not under any threat, is unprecedented in the history of the world. I mean, we sent large, very capable forces overseas in both world wars, and we were under no threat whatsoever from the Germans or in the Second World War, the Japanese. And we've only been in 4 declared wars, and they've been just causes, all of them, and we've been a victorious power in all of them. Almost nobody else can say that.
It's a very good point, because our neighbours to the south, who have, of course, influenced so greatly, it's inevitable.
And have a distinguished military history.
Of course they do. But we were fighting and dying almost 2 years before the Americans were involved in the Second World War.
Now, an American would say, well, that's because you were saps and you were only there because the British were there. We entered the war, and goodness knows they made an immense contribution to both world wars when we were attacked. And that's the way to do it. Now, that's what they would say. But there is another way of looking at it, which is, we entered not just because the British were there, though technically that's what happened in World War I, but not in World War II, but because from the beginning we were prepared to risk everything for the principle of defending the democratic society the Americans believe in as much as we do, but they weren't prepared to do anything about it until they were provoked.
And in the Second World War in particular, I would argue it wasn't as much as a nation state being attacked, but the principles which underpin any decent nation state, democracy, freedom, tolerance, being under attack. Canada said, yes, we are part of this. The Americans, many, of course, you know, many Americans wanted to be involved, but Canada said yes.
Including their president.
Including their president.
But he was a realist, you know. He got them in as fast as he could.
Right.
But referring, of course, to Franklin D. Roosevelt. But that is certainly true. But we have to respect the American tradition. A huge number of Americans came to that country to get away from all that. And that isn't quite the case in Canada. In Canada, we always needed the British, the French no less than the English Canadians, to assure we weren't just swallowed whole by the Americans. So we felt we owed them something.
Right, right. End of the Second World War, we were a power. Our Navy was vast, our armed forces.
Our Navy was the third in the world.
It was, wasn't it?
Because the Germans had sunk the Russian Navy, the British had sunk the German and Italian and even in large measure the French navies, and the Americans had sunk the Japanese Navy. So we were next to the Americans and the British, the biggest Navy. An
enormous number of trained fighter and bomber pilots.
Yep.
How have governments treated the Canadian military since 1945?
It's varied. I think Mr. King and Mr. Saint Laurent were fine. I think Mr. Diefenbaker was all right on the budget, but he got confused. He shouldn't have canceled the Arrow, and he certainly shouldn't have signed on to nuclear warheads in the Beaumark and then done a 180-degree turn. He left the policy in shambles, but he didn't shortchange the Department of Defense. I think Mr. Pearson was all right. I think Mr. Trudeau started a downsizing of the military because he was concentrating all his efforts essentially on social programs to buy votes in Quebec for federalism, which sounds like a cynical thing, but it was a necessary thing to do. He was there to protect federalism against the separatists, and that was one of the ways of doing it. There's less excuse for Jean Chrétien. I think Brian Mulroney tried to bring things back a bit and did resupply the armed forces to some degree. Chrétien let them run down, and I am afraid that this government has let them run down terribly. We have 3 brigades, 15,000 men. They're very good, but they're only 15,000. They're only one, not even one division. And 15 ships in our Navy, and we're on 3 oceans. The Air Force is in a little better condition, but it won't do. We're a G7 country, and I entirely support the positions the Prime Minister's taken on Iran, Ukraine, the Middle East, but you're just going to be the mouse that roared if you don't have some military force, not to go and be a jingoistic power, but to be a serious component of an alliance. And you know, we have to, as the country grows and becomes more important, it has to grow fairly uniformly, economically, militarily, culturally. It just is an expanding force in the world, in a positive sense.
And even for those who are Canadian nationalists, which can mean many things to many people, if we are to have that independence, that autonomy, we have to have a military not to invade people,
of course,
but to stand up and defend what we regard as being quintessentially Canadian.
And to bring something to the table to give us credibility in international forums. And may I add another thing? It is absolutely demonstrable that the surest form of economic stimulus is defense spending. It goes into high-tech areas that ramifies around very productively in terms of job creation, and it is the best form of adult education. Look in the United States, it's a volunteer armed forces, has been since Mr. Nixon's time. They bring in people, many of them relatively uneducated, and they bring them, all of them, to their top educational potential at no cost to the individual. And everyone who leaves after a 10-year tour in the U.S. Armed Forces leaves way ahead of where he started academically.
We'll continue this tomorrow. Comrade Black, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Michael.